Welcome to Wise Squirrels, the podcast for late diagnosed adults with ADHD. I'm your host, Dave Delaney.
Back 50 years ago, I was teaching third and fourth grade and always had a penchant for the kids who had a hard time focusing, even though I didn't realize that's what I was doing.
Mm-hmm.
I'm trained as a licensed clinical psychologist, and so I've seen kids forever. And back then it was called hyperkinetic reaction of childhood. And then in 1980, it became attention deficit disorder with or without hyperactivity. And then in 1994, it became attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. And then with the inattentive hyperactive or the combined.
Right.
And so I have a large clinical practice, medium-sized clinical practice, and was getting a lot of people who we were diagnosing with ADHD. And I actually hired a doctoral level pastoral counselor who was the first adult that I came across who was diagnosed with ADHD.
Oh, no kidding. That's great.
And he actually started working for me, and I could see where all the symptoms of ADHD were showing up. And so that actually really became my niche, because, you know, people with ADHD have that kind of sparkle in their eye that I love. And so, you know, that really was a no-brainer for me. In 1999, I learned about, actually in the middle 90s, I learned about coaching. And because I have an economics and math background, I went into executive coaching, leadership development, and then figured I probably should get trained in that. So I took a coach training program called Mentor Coach, that I'm now the dean of ADHD coaching there. And in our first class, we were supposed to come up with an 8-session program for that we could give to people. And so I partnered with someone else, and we focused on parents of kids who have ADHD. And that created advisor.com, ADDVISOR.com. And that kind of took me on the path of ADHD coaching, which I've been doing since then. I've been teaching ADHD coaching, training ADHD coaches for the last 20 years. And I've really been developing a niche of working with high achievers with ADHD. And it's very often you have high achievers with ADHD that have not been identified with ADHD until they're older, because they never had to work very hard to do what they did, because they were always good at it.
Yeah.
Until things started to fall apart. And that's when they get diagnosed.
It's interesting because that's very much my story here as well. And actually, I interviewed Dr. Bob Dempsey on the podcast, who was the International Space Station director for NASA for 16 years. He was diagnosed with ADHD at 60.
Mm-hmm.
And so, talking about like high achievers, I mean, operating the ISS is a pretty badass role, I have to say.
Well, I did an evaluation of a guy who had been the head of an $800 million government agency under Reagan.
Wow.
And Reagan cut the program. So now all of a sudden he didn't have a job. He decided to be a consultant, and he couldn't organize himself. We evaluated him. He had ADHD, but in the confines of the government programs, he was able to function and do great until he had to manage his own time.
And that seems to be what's happened, at least in my understanding of the increase of diagnosis since the pandemic, is that everybody suddenly was working from home and lost their scaffolding, their offices, their lives. And suddenly it was, working from home with your families and being distracted, and then also falling down rabbit holes on social media where, plenty of ADHD information, misinformation, hopefully not disinformation, lives as well. Is that something you've seen since 2022, like an increase?
We've always had a big flow, so it's hard to see that I've seen any more increase.
Okay.
But but certainly there's a whole big increase on stuff on social media, and a lot of it is either neutral or detrimental. You
Mm,
know, a lot of people coming on, on TikTok and doing their things about how their ADHD shows up, like that's what ADHD is. And, ADHD shows up differently for everybody. So,
yeah.
it can be very misleading.
What are some of the most uh, misleading examples that you're seeing sort of most commonly as far as like, that type of content?
Um, some of these TikTok videos blow me away, and I've kind of blocked them out. So,
Yeah, I don't blame you.
it's like they say, I like doing this and I like doing this and I like doing this and I like doing this. So I have ADHD. It's
Right.
kind of that kind of thing. And it's like,
Yeah.
it's a little bit more complex than that.
Yeah. And I often hear from people how, not on this podcast, of course, but like in conversation, I hear, or when I have a presentation I'm doing called The Root Down, which is about my diagnosis and helping to educate people. With full disclosure, I am not a doctor, and nor do I play one on the internet, but I talk about like, my own experiences with ADHD, partly to remove stigmas and to help educate people. But
Sure.
one thing I hear about a lot is, are we all ADHD sometimes? And I'm like, no. Like,
So here's the deal.
yes.
You have to think about the symptoms of ADHD on a continuum. So on one end is normal inattention, normal hyperactivity, normal impulsivity, which are the primary symptoms of ADHD.
Mm,
As you move along this continuum, there comes a point where it significantly impacts on your life. That's when it becomes a diagnosis.
right.
And the further you move along that continuum, the more severe that diagnosis is, and the more significant it impacts on your life. But that's the critical piece. It has to impact your life. I mean, I have lots of symptoms of ADHD, but my life is not impacted like that. I like to call I have a subclinical type
Yeah.
because I do okay.
Yeah. That's interesting too. Like, because, and actually, this is a question I've been thinking about, which is that, where ADHD or ADD back in the day was diagnosed in children, commonly, uh, adults, when was it that adults could even be diagnosed, in adult age? Because this was something much later, right?
Yeah. So again, we used to diagnose them hyperkinetic reaction in childhood. And I remember when we were doing the diagnoses back in the 70s, and the father, a parent, usually the father would say, well, he behaved just like me when I was a kid, and look at me now. And of course, my response is, yeah, look at you now. But
Right.
but it really wasn't into the middle 80s that they began to recognize that it didn't disappear at age 13.
Right.
It just looked different. So that hyperactive kid that was bouncing all over the place, it's just that it became that internal restlessness that
Mhm.
people with ADHD often feel. That's where that hyperactivity went. And the inattentive stuff stayed there. I mean, uh, the statistics suggest at least up to 80% of the kids who are diagnosed with ADHD still have the diagnosis as adults.
Mm.
So, it's I think that's when it started to become real. But I think over the last 20 years, what happens is what seems to be happening more is when a kid comes in to be evaluated for ADHD, and then the parent goes, yeah, I was just like him as a kid. Maybe I have ADHD.
Yes. Yeah. And that's
And
something oh, sorry, go ahead.
a lot of diagnoses are happening as a result of that.
Yeah. And that's something I'm hearing a lot too. I
So
think,
ADHD,
yeah,
ADHD is as heritable as height.
there you go. There you go. Yeah. Yeah. And it makes a lot of sense. I think in my own diagnosis, it has also helped me to be more uh, empathetic to my mom, who's still around, and also think a little differently about my dad, who is no longer around, and the relationships I've had with both of them over the years, and how now, as I talk to my mom, who's in her 80s, pardon me, I I'm like, where she, constantly interrupts me and she talks with her hands and she loves a cocktail and all these different little things that I find, and
Well,
the likeliness of us sharing that.
what the diagnosis does, and I think for late diagnosed people, it's really a critical piece, is it changes their life narrative.
Yes.
Like all of a sudden, what's happened before is looked at through a different lens.
Yeah. I'm writing my next book about this right now. And so it's been incredible to look back at my life and through the lens of ADHD and realizing why without beating myself up about it either, because I'm
Right.
very careful with that. But understanding my operating system and now understanding, like, giving myself enough grace to realize, like, I've run out of steam. It's okay. Or I can't use these planners because I get overwhelmed too easily. And that's not
Right.
how my brain works, which is what my therapist said. Dave, your brain
Right.
doesn't work that way. It's okay.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, and it's been such a wonderful revelation. And you work with, like, a lot of high achieving, adults, and who's, obviously a big part of the listenership of this show. What are some tips, generally speaking, for folks, being diagnosed later in life?
Well, once they're diagnosed, they've actually cleared the first hurdle.
Yeah,
Because for adults who've been diagnosed later in life, they've been living with this forever and have been dealing with the shame of not being able to reach their potential, or the feeling that, there's something really wrong with them, is that they're, there's a book by Kelly and Raimondo from, I think, the late 90s. You mean I'm not stupid, lazy, or crazy. You
yeah,
know, how people, that's how adults felt.
yeah,
And then they get that diagnosis and it's like, wow. So then the next step really is to let's sort out, what about you as ADHD and what about you as you, and really to kind of figure that out.
yeah. That's a big question that comes up a lot in my mind too, because, and in my own, like, therapy and things, because that is something very, as I've kind of jumped in full steam ahead on learning about ADHD, is that it's that question of, like, okay, well, my humor, I think a lot about my humor, and I know that's something you coach about too, is coaching with
Mm-hmm,
humor and playfulness and things. But, like, I have a lot of background with comedy and humor and studying improv and doing stand up
mm-hmm,
last year for the first time, before the diagnosis, which also explains why I did that. Um, uh, but looking back at my humor, I was a class clown as a kid, and
mm-hmm.
obviously looking back at those report cards, which I actually still have, thanks to my mom, and reading those comments, being the class clown, I it's funny because the ADHD caused me in a way to be silly and not be able to be, like, kind of, quieted or what have you, and being disruptive. But in doing that, I made my teachers laugh sometimes and my classmates laugh. So in a weird way, I think I partly learned about humor in my undiagnosed ADHD. Does that make any sense at all?
Makes total sense. When you look at ADHD and you look at, and kind of looking at how your ADHD shows up and who you are as a person,
Yeah.
I think what's really interesting there is that humor is a part of who you are. And you can communicate and actually have insight with people using your humor.
Mm.
The challenge with ADHD is to harness that power. And I like to think, I'm an ADD coach, that I like to think about coaching as helping the client to create guardrails around their ADHD, because humor and playfulness is one of my strengths, right? However, if I overplay it, then
Yeah.
I'm a buffoon and I lose my credibility. So I need
Yeah.
to keep it in check.
Yeah.
But it's something of who I am, and it's something of who you are.
Yeah. There's a time and a place for it, probably, right?
Yeah, you need to know when to use it.
Yeah. Yeah. What about, like, as far as high achievers masking ADHD? What are
all
some of
the
the
time,
things that you've seen? Yeah.
all the time.
What are some of those common
So what
masking things?
happens is that they they over overdo.
Mm,
So, the reality is neurotypical people are consistent about 2/3 of the time.
mm,
And many of these high achievers with ADHD expect themselves to be consistent 100% of the time. Nobody is.
yeah.
And so it's hard for them to cut themselves some slack. It's like, you know, I'm not perfect and it's okay.
Yeah.
Um, and so I've often seen people that high achievers is that do great at work and then the rest of their life falls apart.
Mm,
They can't maintain relationships that their um, personal care is not, they don't exercise enough, they may not get enough sleep, all that kind of stuff, because they are so focused because they want to make sure that they're successful at work. And that creates a big burden on them. That's really stressful.
mm.
And so one of the things that I help them do is to kind of create some balance.
Yeah. I think with, launching Wise Squirrels, launching this podcast and the website and things was really a way for me to share what I was learning with folks, and to learn myself. But at the same time, um, this passion has become sort of my mission because of helping, teach people about this and help them uh, get diagnosed if they or at least get tested if they see or feel that they could have ADHD. Because I saw that Russell Barkley had a study like a multivariate study, I guess, of that the with undiagnosed and untreated ADHD, life expectancy can be up to 13 years less.
7 years.
Really? I've seen 13
7 years.
now. Okay,
Yeah.
but 13, whatever.
Seven
I
is
guess at the end of the
significantly
day,
more than cigarettes and
yeah,
tobacco. Tobacco is 3 years.
yeah. And then you look at like the cost just alone, like I've written a bit about loneliness and something that's I'm weaving into my book and my talk about this, but um, how like loneliness is like the old Surgeon General Vivek Murphy was talking about how loneliness can have the same adverse health effects as smoking 15 cigarettes a day.
Yes, it
And
can.
so with ADHD and the inability or challenge in managing relationships and friendships and subsequently an RSD combined with that, I'm speaking from my own experience here,
You're
by the
right,
way,
but you're
then
absolutely right.
I'm compounding those adverse health effects that could affect my longevity, right? My
Yes,
ultimate health. Um,
exactly.
what are your thoughts on managing relationships, whether it's friendships, peers, whomever? What are some strategies for that you have found work with adults?
So there's a psychologist, her name is Michelle Novotny. She wrote this great book called What Does Everyone Else Know That I Don't?
Hmm.
And she talks about when you meet people that you should have 3 questions ready, 3 questions deep.
Yeah.
So that means that you go into a situation, you have 3 questions that you're going to ask the person, and then you're going to follow up with 3 questions on each subject. So that forces you as the ADHD person to pay attention to what they're saying,
Yeah.
because that's going to help them feel heard, and that's going to help create that relationship. And then to be, again, self-awareness is key. If you know who you are and can sort out who you are and how your ADHD shows up, you can be authentic with another person.
Mm.
And that's going to help create a relationship, because authenticity is what makes relationships work.
What are some examples of those questions you mentioned? Like if you're out meeting somebody, like three.
So a question might be, so what interesting and exciting have you done in the last 2 weeks?
Yeah.
Some open-ended question.
Yeah.
Um, and and they respond, and then you listen and then come up with another question based on what they're saying.
Oh, I love that. Yeah. So this is the same advice I've given my son, actually, who's more introverted than me. He's more in line with my wife. They're both more introverted. My daughter and I are more extroverted. And he told me once that he hates having to go get his haircut because like he's stuck in the chair and he has to like talk to the woman,
Right.
and he's like, and I said, just ask open-ended questions. Like just ask her like open-ended questions. That way she'll do the bulk of the talking. And I wrote a book a number of years ago called New Business Networking, all about how to network better
Hmm.
and to do it the right way, not to be like
Right.
whipping business cards at people or something.
Right.
And, and it's interesting too. And so I do speak a lot about like helping people retain information and by repeating the information out loud, and you're repeating their names and asking open-ended questions and things. But I also find in sort of reflecting on my own career and the work that I've created over the years with undiagnosed ADHD, so much of the problems that I assume everybody has that I've tried to solve in the content I've created, say networking at a conference and small talk and whatever, body language, things like that. Are, I've I've sought the answers to these questions personally to help myself without realizing. So in a way, it's sort of like the high achievers. I'm surprised. I suppose some of your clients might have this where they have like entrepreneurs who have created products, services, businesses, maybe to solve a problem that they had because of the ADHD. Have you ever run into any of that?
I think that happens all the time. I think
Uh,
what we do is a product of who we are. And
yeah.
so if there's a challenge that we experience, we're going to be looking for solutions. I think that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah. It's interesting. And I think, yeah, yeah, it's definitely interesting, like reflecting on that and realizing like the stuff that I focused on and have created. Yeah. I mean, like anybody can like everybody could be less anxious. Um, but I mean, everybody could be,
Right.
but then there's like the being diagnosed with anxiety, and then for me personally, having been diagnosed with anxiety, now knowing that the root cause of that anxiety is from the ADHD and that the anxiety is a comorbidity. Does that sound?
Well, yes. I mean, so when you think about anxiety, depression,
Mm,
and any other coexisting condition with ADHD, sometimes they're independent of each other, but
mm,
very often they're not. And particularly with anxiety, depression, because kids with ADHD have gotten negative feedback from the environment forever. Things like, you're so smart. How come you didn't do it? Why can't you just do your homework? It's not so hard. It's easy. Why are you not doing that? And people start to interject that sense that they're either stupid, lazy, or crazy.
yeah.
And that kind of happens. The reality is ADHD is not a disorder of knowing. It's a disorder of doing.
Yes.
So so yes, I think so. What happens is people get diagnosed with depression and anxiety, they go through therapy and nothing changes because nobody's seen their ADHD. And once they get the ADHD diagnosis and they start to rewrite the narrative of their life in the light of ADHD, sometimes that depression, anxiety starts to dissipate
Yeah.
because now they can be who they are, and that's okay.
That's interesting. Is there like because I know through my own therapy over the years, I remember something that was very impactful was pre-diagnosis was learning, when you think too much of the past, it can it can lead to depression. If you think too much of the future, it can lead to anxiety. And so the idea of being mindful, being present, being in the now is important. And of course, if you run a business, I mean, obviously you have planning to do and you have to like look back and see how things have
Right.
been and how you screwed up or whatever. Or maybe that's just me. Um, what is that fine line between what I just said, but also what you just said about like being diagnosed and still looking back and looking at your life through that lens in order to, in
So
a positive way, I guess.
yeah, so I think that looking back, as a way to help improve your life in the present and the future makes sense.
Mm.
Looking back to wallow in it doesn't help.
Yes.
I think same for the future. We can look to the future to set some goals of where we want to get to, but in the service of helping us decide decisions that we make now, because we do live in the present.
Mm.
And for a lot of ADHDers, that's okay, because there's two times for people with ADHD. There's now and there's not now. And if it's
Right.
not now, it doesn't exist. So
Yeah.
there's that part too.
And when that now jumps in, where you want to do the thing right away,
Right.
but it's not. In a way, it's sort of the impetus of my doing this podcast in a weird way, right? Like it was me. I started podcasting in 2005, so I've had multiple podcasts over the years, of course, because ADHD. But so knowing that I need to do a podcast about this and jumping right into it, and then realizing, like, looking at my schedule, looking at my time, and realizing, whoa, hold on, like, my business isn't quite where it needs to be, and I'm doing this podcast all the time, like. So any advice on, like, prioritizing what's
That's creating that balance, finding a way to create that balance.
yeah,
I like the Covey matrix, the Eisenhower matrix, or whatever you
yeah,
call it, urgent and important.
yeah, yeah,
It's really easy to take care of the urgent and important ones,
yeah,
and it's really easy to act on the urgent and unimportant ones, but you need to be able to recognize that, yeah, this is unimportant, even though it is urgent. And that the important but non-urgent, you have to plan for,
mm,
and maybe find ways to move it into the urgent category by giving yourself deadlines or having accountability partners.
yeah,
Then you have the unimportant, unurgent. Those are the ones you want to minimize.
yeah. Tell me about CogMed, COGMED, working memory training. What's that?
So CogMed working memory training is a computer-based program that the research on it has suggested that it improves working memory, which is one of the executive functions of ADHD.
Hmm.
Do you remember the game Simon? I mean, with
Yes. Yeah.
the colors and and beeps and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
That's a working memory task,
Right.
because you have to remember them. So what this program does is you do it 5 days a week for 5 weeks, 45 minutes a day, where you're doing these kinds of tasks.
Hmm.
And the theory behind it is that that will help to improve your working memory, which then will help you to better manage the tasks in front of you. Now, the issues with it are generalizability. How far out does it go in terms of helping you to improve different tasks? And
Hmm.
the literature's mixed on that. And then sustainability. How long, after the training, how long does it stick? I've done some research that suggests that after 6 months, it's still there. But it seems like you may need boosters along the way to keep that going.
It's interesting. Like, if you were to say, like, if 100% is that everybody knows 100% exactly what ADHD is, exactly how to treat it, and all the things, like, what percentage are we along the journey of studying and treating ADHD? Like, where are we? Are we 50%, 30%, 70%? Like, what would you think? Not to cure ADHD, I don't mean that, because it's just who we are. That's our operating systems. But I don't want to, not be left-handed or something. That's
It's
fine.
yeah,
But
yeah, it's to manage ADHD.
yeah.
It's hard to put a percentage, because when you think about it, the treatment for ADHD has not changed that much over the last 50 years.
Mm.
Um, I would say one thing that has been different over the last 20 years has been the emergence of ADHD coaching.
Mm.
Um, I think that ADHD coaching has been a strategy that, along with the other strategies of medication and environmental manipulation and those kinds of things that do help people with ADHD. You
Mm.
know, when you look to the future of ADHD, and Sam Goldstein did a presentation at the CHAD conference in November about this, he said that NIMH is only funding research programs that are looking at the biological basis of ADHD. So they're really trying to find biological markers for ADHD. I don't know how close they are, but there's probably a lot to go.
In order to medicate properly, or
Well, once you know the biological
the
underpinnings
cause?
of it,
Yeah.
you know the cause, you can better formulate treatments for it, whether it's medication or anything else.
Yeah. Correct me if I'm wrong here. My understanding is it's not like having ADHD is not 100%. Like it can, like, you, or correct me here. Can you develop ADHD at some point? I've understood, like, maybe head trauma or lead or things like that. Are there, I've read a little bit about it, but I don't know
Yeah,
how
the
accurate that
only
is.
the only acquired ADHD is if there is some form of insult to the head, whether it
Okay.
be trauma or poisoning or something happens
Yeah.
that impacts the prefrontal cortex of the brain, which is where the executive functions lie.
Yeah.
And that can, someone can then have ADHD like symptoms because they've had damage to the brain there. There, the argument pretty much is that it doesn't just show up in adulthood.
Right.
Now, there's also been a couple of studies that suggest people who have not been diagnosed and were not diagnosed as children, that it's possible that it was there, but it just didn't reach the threshold where a diagnosis would be made, because it's that clinical functioning part,
Mhm.
that they may have had some of those symptoms, but it didn't rise to the point of clinical functioning. And I think that happens with high achieving people all the time, because they're usually pretty bright. And so they probably never learned how to study because they didn't have to. They just go into the class and take the test and get 100 because they were smart.
Yeah.
You know, I evaluated a guy who was a senior in college applying to graduate schools in mathematics. Now, I was a math major until I got to abstract algebra junior year of college, and I couldn't do it. I mean, that's wow.
Yeah.
But this guy fell apart because he never had to study. He was that smart that he never had to study. And all of a sudden, senior year came around, and he had all these theoretical mathematical classes that wasn't just intuitive, and he fell apart.
It it reminds me a little bit of like how, like, Alcoholics Anonymous, AA or whatever, have like these, I think it's called like your low point, or like this moment of clarity where you're like, okay,
Bottoming out.
bottoming out.
Yeah.
But it seems kind of similar for ADHDers who seem to like a undiagnosed adult who, like, quote unquote, bottoms out to the point where they're like, okay, I've got to go see a doctor. I've got to figure out what's going on. And thus then the diagnosis and treatment comes from that. Thanks for watching this free segment of Wise Squirrels. To listen to the full interview, please join us at wisesquirrels.com. Sign up there and become a member for like the cost of a coffee a month. It's a good deal. I'll see you there.